Okay. Welcome everybody to iCANX Talks, Connecting the World and the Universe. My name is Professor Martin Thuo, coming to you from North Carolina State University in the Eastern United States. This month, we continue our series with Professor Aaron Rossini from Iowa State University, following the talks by Professor Chen from Tianjin and Hopkins from Leuven, and of course, our Oceania Day that started the month for us. Today, we're going to have a panel consisting of Dr. Reddy, Dr. Kong, and Dr. Hu. And for today's talk, Professor Rossini is going to be telling us about molecular structure determination of inorganic nanomaterials by sensitivity-enhanced solid-state NMR spectroscopy. So let me share with you a little bit about our speaker today. Professor Rossini is a full professor of chemistry at Iowa State University, and he's also a faculty scientist at the U.S. Department of Energy Ames National Laboratory. He's very, very, very prolific with over 150 peer-reviewed publications, most of these in very high-impact journals. His independent research has been recognized with the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship in 2020, and he was awarded the Caraderi Prize in Magnetic Resonance for Young Investigators in 2019 Alpine Conference on Magnetic Resonance. His training consists of PhD in 2010 from the University of Windsor, and then from there he went across the pond to Lyon in France in 2011 and began a postdoc there with Professor Emsri and Desage at the CRNN in Lyon at the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon as a Marie Curie International Incoming Fellow. Then in 2014, he moved to EPFL with Professor Emsri. And then in 2015, he hopped back across the pond into the US and he started his career as an independent scientist, as an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry at Iowa State University. He was promoted to associate professor in 2021, and then soon after this year, he was promoted to full professor. He has done a lot of amazing work, and I would not steal any more time, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Aaron. Aaron?
Great. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Martin. And I just want to say thank you to Alice and Martin for the invitation to speak, and thank you to all the panelists, Yan Yan, Hu, Shuchen Kong, and Manju Reddy, who agreed to participate as the panelists today. I really appreciate them taking their time to come as well. So with that, I'll get into the presentation, and hopefully you're seeing the right set of slides.
Yep.
Okay, great. So before I begin, I just want to thank all the people who actually did the work. This was a somewhat outdated picture of my group from about a year ago, and I'll highlight some of the contributions by the students as we go through it. Most of the work I'm going to show you today was funded by the
Aaron, we're still in the file.
Yes, go ahead. Oh, is it not advancing, or?
We're still on the title slide.
Okay, let's try one more time. Is it advancing now?
No, it's not.
Oh, I see. Wait, it says my screen share is paused. There we go. Let's try that again. 1 sec. Let's try one more time. That's weird. Sorry. Let me just exit the presentation. It was saying that the screen sharing was paused. Sorry about that. Try that one more time. And now it says screen sharing is paused.
Yes, it's okay. Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah, but I don't think, is it advancing? No.
No, it's not.
I'm not sure what the problem is with the sharing. It's advancing before. Let me try to hit. I've never had this problem before. I can try to share the desktop maybe.
Yeah, one more time.
And there we go. That's probably the solution. Now it's advancing.
Yes.
Great. Okay. My apologies for the technical glitch there. Yeah, as I was saying, I just want to thank my research group members, and I'll try to highlight the contributions from the different students as I go through the projects. Most of this work was supported by U.S. Department of Energy, particularly the projects on nanoparticles and 2D materials that I'll talk about. But the first project that's related to catalysis was supported by NSF CBET program. So I appreciate the financial support from them. So really, my research group is interested in studying materials that can address energy needs. So we're interested in studying things like semiconductor nanoparticles that have potential applications in solar cells, displays. We're also interested in 2D materials that have applications in similar fields, also in microelectronics. And then we also like to study heterogeneous catalysts. So where my research group really tries to contribute, and lots of people in the NMR field can work on understanding the characterization of the materials. So if we think about a rational materials design cycle, somebody's going to make something, measure properties or activity. Nowadays, you're probably going to do some sort of calculation of the structure and try to relate it back to these other properties. But characterization is often one of the bottlenecks, especially when we talk about these classes of materials. The reason these materials are difficult to structurally characterize is that they are often disordered, so they don't diffract very well. Their activity may be driven by dilute sites or defects, and those are often difficult to see with bulk characterization techniques. And then the properties are often controlled by surfaces or interfaces. So really, surface characterization is still an unresolved challenge in the physical sciences. So solid state NMR spectroscopy could be an ideal characterization technique for inorganic materials. We can potentially apply it to almost any element from across the periodic table. I'll show you that in a slide. And NMR is really a very powerful characterization technique because the different NMR interactions give us insight into the local structure and symmetry of the atoms that we're probing. So I'm just showing an example here of a magic angle spinning platinum 195 solid state NMR spectrum of cisplatin. And if we measure the isotropic chemical shift, this is the same chemical shift that you would get if you do a solution NMR experiment. This tells us something about the atoms that surround the nucleus that we're probing. So we can get some information about the coordination environment of the nucleus that we're going to observe in our NMR experiment. In solid state NMR, we have the advantage that we can also measure the anisotropic chemical shifts. And this tells us something about the symmetry of the atoms around the nucleus that we're probing. So in this case, we know we have a square planar platinum center because this chemical shift anisotropy is very large. It's on the order of 7,000 parts per million. When we deal with quadrupolar nuclei, we often get these characteristic splittings or powder patterns, and those are again related to the symmetry at the nuclear site. So if we have a trigonal planar boron atom, we'll see this broadened pattern, whereas if we have a higher symmetry tetrahedral boron atom, it'll come in at a different chemical shift, and we'll also see a narrower pattern. And then the real power of NMR relies upon the ability to correlate NMR signals from adjacent spins. So here I'm showing you in cadmium, selenium, HMQC spectrum. I'll talk about this one a little bit later on, but this is showing us the connection between cadmium and selenium atoms that make up a cadmium selenide nanoparticle. And then with NMR, we can really perform accurate measurements of interatomic distances with precision that rivals that of X-ray diffraction. So here I'm just showing a proton platinum distance measurement for a platinum molecule that's supported on the silica surface. So here's the periodic table that we like to use as NMR spectroscopists. The different colors here, green, yellow, and red, are kind of qualitative indicators of how difficult or easy it might be to do an NMR experiment with those isotopes. And the main thing I just wanted to point out is we can really do NMR on nearly all the elements from across the periodic table. The circles are spin 1/2 nuclei. Spin 1/2 nuclei are much easier to work with generally. And then the squares are what are known as quadrupolar nuclei. So those are nuclei that have a nuclear spin greater than 1/2. And quadrupolar nuclei present some challenges because the NMR signals are often broadened by the quadrupolar interaction. And I'll try to show some examples of that later on in the talk and how we can deal with those problems. So one of the issues we have is that NMR is an intrinsically insensitive technique. We need to use large sample volumes, large magnetic fields. And so when we deal with unreceptive isotopes, so the yellow and red ones, we need to come up with ways to enhance the sensitivity of the NMR experiment. And in my group, we like to use combinations of ultra-high magnetic fields, this technique DNP, dynamic nuclear polarization. I'll talk about that a little bit. And then indirect detection is another technique that we use. Okay, and then just a really quick little primer for the non-solid state NMR experts. I'm kind of assuming that people have heard of NMR. You know that we can look at these different elements. We can place them in a magnetic field. If we apply radio frequencies at the correct frequency, we can excite these nuclear spin transitions and observe an NMR spectrum. This slide just gives a little bit of detail on how one does a modern high-resolution solid-state NMR experiment. Number one, we're usually going to be looking at powdered materials. We take those materials and we pack them into these different sample holders that we call rotors. These are called rotors because they're going to be rotating at a very high frequency. So for example, this 4mm rotor, this will rotate at frequencies of up to 15 kilohertz. Whereas if we go to these reduced diameter rotors, these ones will rotate at around 60 kilohertz if we push the spinning frequency. Inside of the NMR magnet, these rotors are going to be oriented at the magic angle, and we're going to rotate the sample around that magic angle. What's magic about the magic angle is it's an angle that bisects a cube. So any of the NMR interactions which have an orientation dependence over the course of one cycle of rotation, we will average the components X, Y, and Z, and this will give us a high resolution or solution-like solid-state NMR spectra. So that's just shown down here. Here we have a carbon spectrum of glycine. There are two unique carbon sites. So if we didn't spin the sample, we'd see these two broad powder patterns. But as we increase the magic angle spinning frequency, we're able to narrow up these NMR lines and recover a high resolution NMR spectrum. Now, when we deal with proton spins, they have very strong homonuclear dipolar couplings. Essentially, all the proton spins are magnetically coupled with one another, and this leads to very broad lines. So we need to go to very fast magic angle spinning frequencies to narrow up the proton NMR signals. This is where these smaller diameter rotors come in handy. Or we can also use special pulse decoupling techniques to narrow up the proton lines. And I just wanted to say for the non-NMR experts, what are the typical sample quantities that we actually need to do an experiment? So you typically need around 100 milligrams of material to pack this 4mm rotor. And then these smaller diameter rotors, they can be advantageous when we deal with samples that are precious or only available in limited quantities. We only need a few milligrams of material to pack these rotors. But there is a sensitivity loss when we reduce the size of the rotor. Okay, so that's enough on the background, and I'll just try to tell three different kind of material stories today. The first one that I'm going to tell you was done in collaboration with the research group of Professor Yves Hermans at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And on my side, former PhD students Rick Dorn and Mike Hanrahan made a lot of contributions, and a former postdoctoral fellow, Bridget Thomas. He's now an assistant professor at NYU Abu Dhabi. He also really made some early and key contributions to this project. So the motivation for this project came about because Yves' group in 2016 published this science paper where they showed that you could take boron nitride-based materials, boron nitride nanotubes, or hexagonal boron nitride, and you could use these as very efficient and selective catalysts for the oxidative dehydrogenation of propane to form propylene. And of course, propylene is a highly valuable feedstock chemical. You can use it in the production of many polymers and other chemicals. So the state-of-the-art catalysts in this field were vanadium dispersed on silica. The problem with those materials is you get these unwanted CO2 and CO over-oxidations that occur. And the reason the HBN and boron nitride nanotube materials are much better is they basically don't over-oxidize appreciably. HBN in particular was much more selective. So you get this very high yield of alkenes. And so this is very great. So if you look at Yves' paper, one of the last figures they had in this paper was this proposed mechanism for how these HBN materials could be catalyzing this transformation. So they think that you have these oxidized edge sites. these edges are where propane molecules can absorb, and this can then promote the oxidative dehydrogenation and the formation of the propylene. So the key questions when we got involved in this project are what's happening to the catalyst under reaction conditions, what are the catalytically active sites on HBN and boron nitride nanotubes, and as I'll show you, if we can answer these two questions, then that can inform the rational design of improved catalyst materials. So we started with some very simple experiments here. These are just 1D boron NMR spectra. You can typically acquire these in a couple minutes. You don't need any special equipment. Anywhere that has a solid state NMR spectrometer could really do these experiments. So on the top, we have the boron 11 NMR spectrum of fresh boron nitride nanotubes. There's primarily one boron NMR signal, and this is the signature of a trigonal planar boron atom that's coordinated by 3 nitrogen atoms. So those would be the boron atoms that make up the bulk structure of boron nitride nanotubes. There's a little bit of oxidation in this sample. And then we looked at a boron nitride nanotube sample that had been used as a catalyst for this oxidative dehydrogenation reaction. Now, the reaction conditions are quite harsh. These catalysts are going to be on stream for 24 hours at 500 degrees Celsius, subjected to gas flows of oxygen, propane, and nitrogen. So what we see is really interesting. If we just look at this boron 1D NMR spectrum, you can see that about 70% of the material has been converted from a nitride to oxides and hydroxide species. And you can see these morphological changes if you look at these SEM images where we have these fresh nanotubes, and you've really changed the textural properties of the sample after it's been spent or used for catalysis. Now, if you look at the activity for the propane conversion, the boron nitride nanotubes, they actually get better over time as you leave them on stream. There's kind of this induction period. And so when you combine these two facts that, you know, this material is getting better as you run it, and you can see that the oxidation is very extensive, that leads you to conclude that it's not actually the boron nitride that might be the catalytically active species, rather it's the oxidized surfaces of these materials. So one of the problems with these boron NMR spectra is we get these broad NMR signals. This is because boron's a spin 3/2 quadrupolar nucleus. So one of the ways that we can deal with this signal broadening is to work at a higher magnetic field. So we were fortunate to be able to use this 35 Tesla, 1.5 gigahertz would be the proton Larmor frequency on this instrument. So this is a superconducting hybrid magnet. And this is at the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory in Tallahassee, Florida, working in collaboration with Dr. Jiehong Gan and Dr. Ivan Hung. And so the advantages for these ultra high fields are really profound when we look at the NMR spectra of quadrupolar nuclei like boron. If we work on a 9.4 Tesla magnet, 400 megahertz NMR magnet, we get these broad overlapping peaks. But this quadrupolar broadening is inversely proportional to the strength of the applied field. So by going to the highest possible magnetic field, we can really narrow the patterns. And in fact, your resolution in your 1D spectrum is going with the square of the applied magnetic field. So that's how we can get these dramatic reductions in line width and really great improvements in resolution. The advantage of looking at the 35 Tesla NMR spectrum is now we can just integrate the peaks individually. And what it basically tells us is about 50% of the boron nitride nanotubes in this sample that we looked at remained as nitride. 22% was partially oxidized. So we had some of these signals in the middle or intermediate region, which we think correspond to having 2 nitrogens and 1 oxygen in the boron coordination sphere, or 2 oxygens and 1 nitrogen. And then about 28% of the borons were fully oxidized. So now we can do a 2D boron-boron homonuclear correlation experiment. So what we're going to map out in this spectrum are connections between boron NMR signals, as long as the boron atoms are within a couple angstroms of one another. So what's kind of interesting is we see these intense correlations within a group. So we have nitride kind of coordinated to nitride, oxide show an intense correlation to oxides, but then we can see these off-diagonal correlations. And this is probably corresponding to the interface between the nitride and oxide layers. So we think this type of 2D NMR spectrum gives evidence that we have this nitride base of material, and then you have this oxidized material that's growing off the surface. And that's because you have these harsh reaction conditions where you have lots of oxygen and water is being formed as a byproduct as you dehydrogenate the propane. Okay, so what can you do with all that information? What you can do is turn around and try to rationally synthesize cheaper and better performing boron-based dehydrogenation catalysts. So what Eve's group did is they took activated carbon. You can treat this with nitric acid. This will introduce oxide functionalities, carboxylic acids, ketones on the surface. And then these acid groups can be used to bind boron. So you can just take your carbon material, wash it with a boric acid solution, and you'll end up depositing this layer of boric acid or boron oxide on the surface of these carbon materials. And you can really build up some thick layers of this boronic acid and boron oxide. Okay, so how does this material perform as a catalyst? It gives the exact same catalytic performance basically as the HBN. So this is really nice because activated carbon is a very inexpensive material, and boric acid is much cheaper, much lower energy cost than something like boron nitride. Okay, so what do we think is going on? Now we can turn to the NMR data to try to understand the structure of the boron atoms in this material. So here we have the 35 Tesla 1D boron NMR spectrum, and then we have a 2D correlation experiment. We basically see one boron signal. This is probably boron atoms that have both bridging oxides or hydroxyl groups in the first coordination sphere. We've done some proton boron NMR experiments to confirm that we have hydroxyl groups present. I'm not going to show that data. So the boron NMR is a little difficult to get a clear picture of this material. So what we can do is turn to oxygen NMR. Now O17 is the NMR active isotope of oxygen. Unfortunately, it's only 0.037% abundant. So we need to oxygen enrich. Fortunately, it's not that hard to O17 enrich these materials. You can just buy some O17 enriched water from different stable isotope companies. O17 enriched water is actually not that expensive. The 40%, you can typically get it for less than $1,000 for a gram. That may sound expensive, but you only need usually 50 or 100 microliters of the water to enrich your materials. So, it only turns out to be a cost of say $50 or $100 per sample, which isn't that bad. So for this boron oxide on carbon material, what you can do is simply wash it repeatedly with a bit of O17 water, and that oxygen from the water will then get incorporated into the oxide layer. So now we can do the O17 NMR spectrum, and the O17 NMR is very clear what's happening. We have two sets of O17 NMR signals. We have an oxygen that bridges two borons, and then we have this clear hydroxyl signal. We can do a more advanced 2D NMR experiment. This is known as an MQMAS experiment, and this resolves the different overlapping oxygen signals. Okay, we can keep going. So the other thing we can do here is then do a boron-oxygen 2D correlation experiment. And this really confirms that we have this disordered network model where we really have borons with bridging oxygens and hydroxyl groups, and it's all kind of randomly dispersed on the surface of this oxidized activated carbon support. Okay, so just to summarize that project, there was this interesting discovery by Yves Herman's group about the selective catalysis that's provided by boron nitride for the dehydrogenation of propane. If we do some NMR experiments, we can gain some understanding of the structure, and then we can use that information to design improved catalysts. Okay, just to switch topics in case you're not that interested in catalysis, I'm going to talk about 2D materials briefly. So there's lots of interest in 2D materials in the field of materials chemistry because you can basically find a 2D material with any property that you desire, from superconductors, semiconductors, insulators, and then you can make porous versions of many of these different materials. The research questions that my group is interested in addressing in this field is, can we, one, determine the bulk structure of disordered 2D materials? Due to the way that many of these materials are synthesized, they're often very disordered in structure. So even the bulk structure of many of these materials is unknown. But even in cases where the bulk structure is unknown, we'd like to be able to look at the structure of the edges or surfaces of these materials because those are often important for the applications. And then many of these materials are going to be post-synthetically functionalized by different molecules to impart new functionality or behavior. And so you want to be able to follow that molecular functionalization of these materials. For the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about this first point, though. If you're interested in 2D materials, there's a number of different papers that we've published in this area. So we've done some nice work on porous boron nitride. We've also looked at the surface structure of hexagonal boron nitride. That's in a separate paper. It's not on this slide, but you can check that out if you're interested. This was some nice work we did in collaboration with Alexandra Velian's group at University of Washington, where we tried to look at the molecular functionalization of black phosphorus. This is a recent paper we did with Dimitri Talipin's group that just came out in Nature Chemistry, where we looked at these hybrid mexenes, where you have a mexene that's now passivated by organic ligands, and we can use NMR to understand the binding modes of the ligands on the surface of those mexenes. And then we have some forthcoming work on some fundamental aspects of selenium-77 NMR spectroscopy of transition metal dichalcogenides like tungsten selenide and molybdenum selenide. The story I'm going to focus in on today, though, is the structure of this 2D silicon material. So this material is sometimes known as silicane. And this is really work that's done in collaboration with Matt Panthani's group at Iowa State Chemical and Biological Engineering. Collaborators on this project also include Dr. Rana Biswas. And then the students who did this work were Mike Hanrahan started this project, and Rick Dorn, and a new student in the lab, Sajiwa Lamahuaj, really did a lot of great work to push this project forward. Okay, so how do you make 2D silicon? In this field of 2D materials, it's known that you can start with the precursor that has a similar structure to the final material that you want. So in this case, you can take this calcium silicide material, which is a layered material where you have these layers of silicon atoms separated by layers of calcium ions. And you can do what's known as a topotactic deintercalation. That just means that we're going to deintercalate or remove the calcium ions. You're going to do that with an HCl solution. And then it's a topotactic deintercalation because the framework structure of the precursor material is thought to be preserved after the deintercalation reaction. So this is not a new material by any means. These types of materials and reactions were actually first done back in 1863 and 1921. However, despite the fact that those initial experiments were so early, you can go in the literature and you can look up many different material structures. So some people think that these materials from this deintercalation reaction have oxygens that get inserted between the silicon atoms. Some people think you get hydrogen terminated materials. Some think that there's hydrogen termination and hydroxyl termination. So really this is a great area for NMR because we can differentiate these different structural models. Okay, so a little bit on the synthesis and optical properties and why this material might be interesting. Here's some SEM images showing the calcium silicide precursor. After you do the deintercalation, you can see you form this layered 2D material. You can even find some nice isolated sheets if you do some careful TEM experiments. From an optical materials perspective, these are very interesting because this is a way to turn silicon into a direct bandgap material. Three-dimensional silicon is normally indirect bandgap. And these materials are luminescent. They have about a 9% PLQY here. Okay, so just starting with Raman and FTIR spectroscopy, this was work that Matt's group did. You can establish some of the functional groups that should be present. You can see lots of stretching frequencies that correspond to SIH groups. You can also see some SIO functionality and maybe even pick out some SICL. So using that information and the information from NMR that I'm about to show you, this is our best kind of structural model for this material at the moment. We're going to have these 2D layers of silicon atoms. About 70% of the silicon atoms are going to be hydrogen terminated. 20% are going to be chlorine terminated, and about 10% are going to be hydroxyl terminated. So I'll just take you through the NMR evidence for this model really quickly. This is some careful quantitative silicon-29 NMR spectroscopy work that my student Rick Dorn did. And what he showed here is about 70% of those H atoms are hydrogen terminated, 20% are chlorine, and 10% are hydroxyl. So that's how we get those proportions. And then we can do some other NMR experiments to prove this structural model. So number one, if we look at proton NMR, we see 1 in 10 set of signals at about 4 ppm. That is characteristic of an SIH group. We can also see signals at around 1.5 ppm, which we attribute to the hydroxyl groups. We can acquire the silicon NMR spectrum in a couple different ways. I just showed you a direct excitation one. This one's obtained with a technique called cross-polarization. So basically, as long as our silicon is within 3 or 4 angstroms of a proton, it's going to show up in this experiment. So if we have say, silicon that's chlorine terminated, but it's nearby to a neighboring H atom, we'll still see its NMR signal. So the main signals we see in this experiment are, again, the ones that we're assigning to H-terminated silicon atoms. We can confirm that with a different NMR experiment. This is known as an inept experiment. So what we exploit here are the J couplings between the hydrogen and silicon, and we'll only have an observable J coupling if we have a covalent bond between the 2 isotopes, basically. So this really does confirm that this is the SIH NMR signal. And then these other NMR signals, they're absent from this inept spectrum because we don't have a directly bonded hydrogen. Now we've done some other advanced 2D NMR experiments here. This is a silicon-silicon correlation experiment. So we're going to see a correlation here if the silicon atoms are covalently bonded to one another. So we get an intense correlation for the hydrogen-terminated silicon atoms. That's because there's going to be many of those, and they're all going to be neighboring with one another. But we can also see that those hydrogen-terminated silicon atoms are bonded to silicon atoms which have a chlorine or hydroxyl termination. So this type of 2D NMR spectrum is really helpful because it tells you these secondary NMR signals are not just some phase-segregated impurity. They're really part of the 2D sheets. This is a nice proton-silicon inept oscillation curve we can get. So basically what we do is we vary the mixing times for which we let the J couplings evolve in this inept experiment. And the key observation here is if we have a silicon monohydride group, so that is the hydrogen and the silicon are in a 1-to-1 stoichiometry, then based upon the appearance of this curve, it should be the same curve when we vary this tau or tau prime period in this experiment. And that's exactly what we see. So this really confirms that we have SIH groups in these 2D materials. Finally, we have this 2D proton silicon dipolar heteronuclear correlation spectrum. And this just confirms that those hydroxyl groups are there and that they really are part of the sheet as well. Okay, so we already saw this data. This was our quantitative silicon-29 NMR spectrum that suggests about 20% of these silicon atoms are chlorine terminated. So what we did in this recent 2023 paper is we really wanted to prove that we had covalent chlorine present in the sheets. If you read some of the early papers in this field, they always noticed that the chlorine was there because it was used for the deintercalation step with the hydrochloric acid. But some of those papers have just said that you end up with HCl that's kind of trapped in between the sheets. You just have these HCl molecules. You don't necessarily have covalent chlorine bonded to silicon. So one of the ways that we could prove that we have chlorine covalently bonded to silicon is to perform a chlorine-35 NMR experiment. Chlorine-35, it's got a 75% abundance. It's a spin 3/2 nucleus. It's got pretty favorable NMR properties. One of the problems is the chlorine NMR spectra tend to be very wide. So I'm showing you here a chlorine-35 NMR spectrum of this molecule, transplatin. The reason we took transplatin here is because the quadrupolar coupling constant, that tells us about the width of this spectrum. It just so happens that if you have a chlorine that's terminally bound to platinum, it's going to have a very similar chlorine quadrupolar coupling constant to a chlorine that's covalently bonded to silicon. That's known from the literature. So this was just a model setup compound for us. Furthermore, it's about 25% weight chlorine, very similar chlorine weight content to the 2D silicon sheets. So a spectrum like this, you can get this in a couple hours if you use some advanced wide line NMR techniques. So that tells us that chlorine NMR works well. However, you take this experiment and you try to apply it to this 2D material and you see no chlorine NMR signal. Now, this is a real problem in the field of NMR. The absence of evidence is not the evidence for absence whenever we do NMR spectroscopy. There are many possible mechanisms that can lead to the appearance of no NMR signal. So in this case, we think that we just have unfavorable chlorine NMR relaxation properties in this material. Specifically, we probably have a short T2, and this leads to no signal when we try to record the chlorine spectrum directly. So what we did is we switched to an indirect detection strategy. So what we can do is observe the silicon-29 NMR signals, and within a couple hours, we can get a spectrum that shows us those minor NMR signals that we think are associated with silicons that are chlorine terminated. So we can observe those silicon NMR signals. We can apply what's known as dipolar recoupling. This reintroduces the magnetic couplings between silicon-29 and chlorine-35 under magic angle spinning conditions. And then if we apply a saturation pulse on the chlorine channel, we can induce a loss of the silicon NMR signal for those silicons that are attached or nearby to a chlorine atom. So if we do this type of analysis, this signal that we're saying is silicon terminated by chlorine, it appears to show the biggest reduction. And we can plot this curve by monitoring this reduction of the silicon NMR signal as a function of the recoupling time. We can fit this, and this is kind of consistent with a 2.1 angstrom silicon chlorine distance. So this gives some good evidence for covalent chlorine in this material. The problem is that, silicon-29, it's not the easiest nucleus to work with. It's only 5% naturally abundant. And we have sensitivity losses when we do these types of experiments because we have to have a very long spin echo time. So you may not be very convinced by this slight reduction in the NMR signal that it's even real. So let's improve the sensitivity by going to a more sensitive nucleus. Hydrogen gives the best sensitivity for NMR. So what we can do is a hydrogen detected experiment where we can pick up these chlorine atoms. So here we use this pulse sequence that's known as double echo restore. We're going to observe the hydrogen NMR spectrum, apply dipolar recoupling to reintroduce the couplings between proton and chlorine-35. And then if we apply a saturation pulse on the chlorine spins, we'll see a reduction in signal if our hydrogen atoms are within a couple angstroms of a chlorine. Now, if we look at our structural model, essentially every hydrogen atom is going to be within a couple angstroms of a chlorine atom because these chlorine atoms should be randomly dispersed across the sheets. So indeed, that's what we see. If we do the control experiment where we don't apply the chlorine pulses, then we turn on the chlorine pulses, we can see this reduction in signal, and then we have this difference NMR signal. So this is really showing us the fraction of proton or hydrogen atoms that experience a magnetic coupling with chlorine. Now, how do we get a chlorine spectrum out of this? What we do is we plot this difference signal or dephasing as a function of the chlorine pulse offset. And this ends up mapping out the chlorine spectrum for us very nicely. So we can simulate this using numerical simulation NMR software program called Simpson. So that's our fit. And then furthermore, what we can do is take structural models like this, put them into plane wave DFT calculations, and we can predict what the chlorine quadrupolar coupling constant should be and what this chlorine spectrum should look like. So the green in the orange curve, green is our DFT, orange is our best fit to the experimental data points, which are shown in black. Okay, so that gives us very good confidence that we've detected chlorine, covalent chlorine in this material. Now, why should a material scientist care? It's because composition is what tunes the properties of your material, right? So again, we turn to some plane wave DFT calculations. If we had a fully hydrogen terminated 2D sheet, you'd see that you'd end up with a band gap that's a little bit bigger than 2 eV. These band gaps aren't perfect. It's well known that DFT doesn't get these perfect, but the trends are correct. So if you have hydrogen termination, you're actually going to end up with an indirect band gap semiconductor. However, if we start to introduce chlorine or hydroxyl termination, you see you're able to drop the band gap and you're able to get a direct band gap material. So this just gives a nice example of how you can tune the properties of these materials by varying the composition. That's one of the things that we want to work on in the future with the Panthani group, trying to increase that hydroxyl termination or even go to something that's 100% chlorine terminated. Okay, that was a little bit on the 2D materials, and then I'm just going to switch topics one last time and tell you a little bit about semiconductor nanoparticles as the final topic in the talk. Of course, there's a huge interest in this class of materials. Typically, what we're going to have is an inorganic crystalline core. It's going to be made up of materials like cad selenide, cad sulfide, cad telluride, silicon. etc. There's been a lot of interest recently in perovskite-based nanoparticles as well. So you're going to have this inorganic core with these organic ligands that terminate the surface. You need the ligands to impart colloidal stability to these materials and also to prevent the inorganic cores from reaggregating and just forming larger particles. Now, what's important in the field of nanoparticles is that once we reduce the size of this core to, say, a few nanometers, then we get this very high surface area to volume ratio. So, if your nanoparticle is a couple nanometers in diameter, roughly 30 to 50% of the atoms might actually be surface atoms. And this becomes really important to address because then the surface chemistry and the structure of those surface atoms can really dictate the bulk properties of the material. So this is some classic work from John Owen's lab, where they're stripping off some carboxylic acid ligands from cad selenide. So if you have a high ligand density, you get a very bright fluorescent nanoparticle, but as you strip those surface ligands away, it's thought to leave behind under-coordinated, unpassivated cadmium atoms, and this ends up creating electronic trap states that ruin the fluorescence of these materials. So this example just underscores that really the surface chemistry and surface properties can end up dictating the properties of the bulk material. And this is some nice DFT modeling from Ivan Infante and Zeger Hens to understand how these trap states come in if you have these unpassivated surface atoms and why this ruins the fluorescence and emission properties of the nanoparticles. This was a really nice perspective that just came out in JAX in 2021 from Gillian Dempsey's group. If you're interested in nanoparticle characterization, I would really recommend this article. So it goes through all the standard techniques that are used to study the surfaces of nanoparticles. Big emphasis on solution NMR, a little bit a mention of solid state NMR. But if you look at these techniques, it's really difficult to study that top layer of surface atoms in with these different characterization techniques. And so that's really where solid state NMR spectroscopy is poised to fill in this gap. We can really look at this top layer of surface atoms with very good selectivity. And I'll try to show you how we can do that. So this idea of using NMR to look at nanomaterials, this is not a novel idea. There's been many NMR groups that have tried to look at these materials. So this is a classic example from Bell Labs, where they did some selenium-77 NMR experiments on cad selenide nanoparticles. And so you can see if you start with bulk cad selenide, you have this very sharp symmetric signal. You should only have one selenium NMR signal here because all the selenium atoms within the lattice are symmetry related and are equivalent to one another. But as you go to nanoparticles, you start to see broadening and new shifts coming in. And this is because you're now having surface atoms which reside in a distinct electronic and coordination environment as compared to the atoms in the bulk. This is some nice work from Jeff Strauss' lab at Florida State University. What they did here are some proton to selenium cross-polarization solid-state NMR experiments. This is a nice experiment because it provides surface selectivity. So what you're going to do is you're going to initially start with the magnetization of proton spins, which are likely associated with the organic ligands that passivate the nanoparticles. And then using a cross-polarization step, you can transfer that polarization to, say, selenium spins or cadmium spins, whatever NMR active spin is on the surface of your nanoparticle. In this case, it was selenium. So you can transfer that magnetization from protons to selenium spins that are within a few angstroms of the surface. And by tuning the contact time in the cross-polarization experiment, you can be more or less selective for the surface. So this is shown here for two spectra with different contact times. At shorter contact times, you see these broader surface signals coming in. And if you push the contact time longer, you can start to see these core NMR signals that would have a similar chemical shift to bulk cad selenide coming in. Okay, one of the problems with all of these examples, though, is that the NMR experiments suffer from low sensitivity. And if we're just trying to look at the fraction of atoms that make up the nanoparticle surface, this can be challenging just because it's a dilution problem. So we need some way to enhance NMR sensitivity. And what we do in this project is we use a technique that's known as dynamic nuclear polarization, DNP. So the idea behind a DNP experiment is we're going to dope our samples with stable free radicals. And the reason we want to do that is that electron spins are actually highly spin polarized inside of a magnetic field. So we usually do these experiments on a 9.4 Tesla magnet and at a sample temperature of around 100 Kelvin. Under those conditions, the electron spins are going to be about 6% polarized. Now, the problem we have in NMR, and the reason why it's an insensitive technique that requires large sample volumes, large magnetic fields, is that the nuclear spins are basically not polarized, right? There's very little population difference between our nuclear spins. It's something like 0.01% population difference between the nuclear spin states, okay? So this is why NMR is an insensitive technique. Whenever you do spectroscopy, your signal is proportional to the difference in the population of spin states. In NMR, we have basically no population difference. So DNP can address this problem because what we do is essentially a combined EPR and NMR experiment. We try to saturate the electron spins at their Larmor frequency. And if we can do this in the correct way, we can transfer that spin polarization to the nuclear spins and get a massive enhancement of the NMR signal. So DNP is actually a really old idea. It was invented in the 1950s, but since about 2009, Bruker has been offering this commercial DNP instrumentation, which is really based off the designs of Bob Griffin's group at MIT. And we have one of these commercial 400 megahertz, 263 gigahertz DNP systems in the DOE Ames lab. So the way this system works is we have our 400 megahertz wide bore NMR magnet. This is where we're going to do the NMR experiments. While we're doing a magic angle spinning experiment, we have a special probe that cools the samples down to 100 Kelvin. So keep that in mind. Any DNP data I show is at 100 Kelvin. And then we have this device in the background. This is the gyrotron. The gyrotron outputs about 20 watts of 263 gigahertz microwaves, comes through this transmission line, and the microwaves will come up and hit the sample while we're undergoing the magic angle spinning at 100 Kelvin. Okay, so here's an example of what we can do with DNP. This is just some carbon-13 solid-state NMR spectra of histidine hydrochloride. It's a microcrystalline solid. We've had to dope it with our nitroxide biradical to do the DNP experiment. So if we perform or acquire the carbon NMR spectrum without DNP, we get a signal-to-noise ratio of about 15 after 8 scans. This is kind of typical solid-state NMR performance for a natural abundance carbon sample. But if we go turn on the gyrotron, we start saturating the electron spins, we transfer that spin polarization to the protons, and then we go to the carbon, we can get this massive gain in the NMR sensitivity. We go up to signal-to-noise ratio 2,100. We've made our NMR signals 150 times larger and brought them above the thermal noise level. Okay, so how can we do a DNP experiment on a semiconductor nanoparticle? This is some work I first did back in my postdoc with Lyndon Emsley's group, and this was a really nice collaboration with Maxim Kovalenko and Christophe Copperet. So Maxim and Christophe came up with the idea of how we're going to do DNP on a nanoparticle. The first thing we actually tried to do was just take a colloidal nanoparticle solution, dissolve our polarizing agent in it, and then freeze the nanoparticle solution. But we ran into a very simple problem. When we put the samples into the DNP, they don't freeze immediately. Maybe takes them 20 or 30 seconds to cool down to 100 Kelvin. And so during that time, the nanoparticles will just precipitate if you try to polarize a bulk colloidal solution of nanoparticles. And you'll end up getting a phase segregation between the radical polarizing agent and the nanoparticles that you want to study. In order for the DNP experiments to work well, we need to get this polarizing agent within a couple nanometers of the target material that we're trying to polarize. So Maxim and Christophe came up with a really simple solution to this problem. What we do is we just take mesoporous silica. We'll impregnate the silica with our nanoparticle solution. This will bring some of the nanoparticles into the pores of the silica. And we can also add that polarizing agent solution into the pores. Typically, our solvent here is going to be tetrachloroethane. So now the nanoparticle and the polarizing agent are trapped together. If you cool them down, they can't get separated. So how does this DNP experiment actually work? Okay, so we start with electron irradiation. So this is coming from that gyrotron, 263 gigahertz. We saturate some electron spins. This results in a polarization transfer to nearby proton spins. Now, in the solid state, this is a frozen sample. All of these proton spins are rigid and immobile. That means they're all magnetically coupled to one another. And any magnetization which I get off the electron spin initially will be transferred to nearby proton spins, and it will kind of diffuse throughout the sample. We call this proton spin diffusion. So this will bring some proton magnetization to protons nearby to the surface of the nanoparticle. And now we can use an NMR-based experiment like cross-polarization to go from the proton spins to, say, nearby cadmium or selenium spins that would sit at the surface of the nanoparticle. And if we dial in this contact time, the rate of polarization transfer from the protons to the cadmiums, that depends upon the strength of the coupling between the proton and cadmium spins. And that's dependent upon the cube of the distance between the proton and cadmium. So this really makes this experiment surface selective if we go for short contact times. If we go for longer contact times, then we can start to push the polarization into the core of the nanoparticle. We also have other experiments we can use to do that. Okay, so this is the initial way that we were doing DNP back in 2015. In 2019, my group came up with a slightly better recipe for doing these DNP NMR experiments on nanoparticles. I'll just skip over the details a little bit, and I'll just say the way that we do this now is we first take a solution of the nanoparticles, we remove the solvent, we precipitate the nanoparticles out of solution, we mix them with hexagonal boron nitride, and then we impregnate the hexagonal boron nitride nanoparticle mixture with our radical polarizing agent. So our nanoparticles are probably partially clustered and aggregated together, but this gives us a much higher concentration of nanoparticles in the rotor. And it turns out HBN has some favorable properties for the DNP experiment. It helps to better couple the 263 gigahertz microwaves into the sample. That's why we like to use this hexagonal boron nitride material. So compared to this old procedure, we can really get kind of routine 9 or 10-fold improvements in NMR sensitivity through the combination of increased concentration of the nanoparticles and better DNP enhancements. Okay, so I'll show you some DNP data for CAD selenide here in a moment. I just want to go through this really quickly and show that with NMR, we can really get precise, detailed structural models of what's happening. What does the surface of a nanoparticle look like? So in this project, we've looked at these CAD selenide 2D plates and these spherical CAD selenide particles. Now we know that plates should have this 001 type facet terminating it. For spheres, we think we also mainly have this 100 family of facets or surfaces. In addition, our NMR data would suggest that we have these 111 facets. But just focusing on the 100, since this is the predominant surface termination in both of these types of nanomaterials, this is the detailed structural model that we're able to arrive at from NMR. Number one, NMR establishes, and you can also combine this with FTIR, and I'll talk about that in a second, that you really have these chelating bidentate carboxylate ligands that are bonded to cadmium atoms at the surface. Each of those cadmium atoms is then going to be coordinated to 2 selenium atoms. And then if we get below this surface selenium layer, we take on the bulk structure of CAD selenide. So each cadmium and selenium below this surface layer is then going to be coordinated by 4 other seleniums or 4 other cadmiums. Okay, so how do we know this is a good structural model? This is actually some nice work from Shuchen Kong and Xiaogang Peng. So what they showed is they did some carbon NMR experiments and FTIR experiments and coupled that with DFT calculations of different ligand binding modes. And they could really show that the dominant ligand binding mode was really this chelating one on the nanoparticles. Now, these other carbon NMR signals that they see, these are likely binding to 111 facets, and we see the same type of thing in the NMR data that I'll show you on the next couple of slides. So this was a really nice paper. Okay, so what we have here are some cadmium DNP enhanced NMR spectra and selenium NMR spectra of the 2D CAD selenide plates and then the spherical CAD selenide nanoparticles. Now, both cadmium and selenium are spin 1/2 nuclei that are both pretty amenable to NMR experiments. The interesting thing we can see is that when we compare the nanoplates, which is shown in pink, and the nanospheroids, if we look at both of these types of NMR spectra, they're very similar. And these are cross-polarization spectra that are selective for the surface. So right away, just looking at these 1D NMR spectra, it's suggesting to us that we really have the same surface morphology in both of these samples. Now we can see in both types of spectra, both surface and core NMR signals, and I can explain how we can assign those later on if you have interest. Okay, so how do we get structural information from those 2D NMR, or from those cadmium and selenium NMR spectra? We go to some different 2D NMR experiments. So this was an old experiment I did back in collaboration with Kovalenko's group. What we did is we carbon labeled the carboxylate ligands, and this allowed us to do, when we use DNP, a carbon cadmium 111 correlation experiment. So this really proves that the NMR signal that we're calling the surface one is really the cadmium atoms that are coordinated by that carboxylate ligand. Now, if we look at these cadmium NMR spectra, they tend to be very broad. All of these additional signals that you're seeing here are called spinning sidebands. They appear at integer multiples of the magic angle spinning frequency. So in this case, we were spinning the sample at 10 kilohertz. All of these peaks are separated by 10 kilohertz. Only this one is a real peak. We can figure that out by recording the spectra at 2 different MAS frequencies. But those sidebands are really annoying because they obscure and hide any minor NMR signals that might be there. So what we can do is go to this 2D experiment that's known as a magic angle turning experiment. This magic angle turning experiment removes the sidebands, and it only gives us what's known as an isotropic NMR spectrum. So now if we do the magic angle turning experiment, we're able to see this major surface signal. We're able to see NMR signals from cadmium atoms in the core. And then we're able to pick out these minor NMR signals, which we think are associated with the 111 facets. In addition, in the MAT spectrum, now we can pull out these 1D cadmium NMR spectra at different isotropic chemical shift positions. And if we look at these spectra, they provide us with useful structural information. So for the bulk signal, we know this must be cadmium that's coordinated by 4 selenium atoms. Those are perfectly tetrahedral cadmium atoms. There won't be any chemical shift anisotropy. What that means is we shouldn't see any spinning sidebands, and this is exactly what happens. Now, if we look at the major surface NMR signal, we can see we have this intense family of spinning sidebands. That tells us there's a relatively large chemical shift anisotropy, and that's consistent with the fact that we've broken the symmetry of the tetrahedron here. While our cadmium atom might have an overall tetrahedral geometry, the fact that we have 2 seleniums and 2 oxygens, this results in a anisotropic local cadmium environment, and that's reflected in the chemical shift anisotropy. Likewise, these minor NMR signals, they come at isotropic chemical shifts, which we think correspond to a cadmium with, say, 3 seleniums and 1 oxygen in the coordination sphere. So these could be bridging carboxylate ligands, which Xu Chen saw evidence for in his studies. And we think these are on the 111 type facets. And then you can also have another type of 111 facet, which would be cadmium terminated. We'd have 3 oxygens from carboxylate ligands and 1 coordinated selenium. And that fits with this isotropic shift that we can observe here. Okay, if we want to really focus in on the structure of the 100 surfaces, since this is the major surface termination that's present, we can again go to some more advanced 2D NMR experiments. So this is a selenium cadmium JHMQC spectrum. So we're using 1 bond J couplings between our cadmium and selenium atoms to generate this 2D correlation map. So if we look at the selenium NMR spectrum, we have the surface signals, the core NMR signals, and then we can see how those selenium NMR signals correlate back to the cadmium. The first connection we can see is surface selenium connected to surface cadmium. That's exactly what we'd expect because those should be connected by a covalent bond. Now, if we work our way further down, we can see that we also have surface selenium atoms, which are bonded to core type cadmium atoms. That makes sense. Now, if we look at the core selenium atoms, they're connected to core cadmium atoms. We would expect that correlation to be present. And importantly, we don't see this selenium core surface cadmium correlation present because that would be separated by 3 bonds. And so this J coupling would just be too weak to give a correlation in this experiment. Okay, now we can do one more NMR experiment, and this really allows us to read out the coordination number and determine what's bonded to the cadmium and selenium atoms. This is known as a heteronuclear spin echo or a J-resolved experiment. And what we're going to do is say observe selenium while we apply an inversion pulse on the cadmium spins. If we vary the timing of this pi pulse, we'll see a minimum in the selenium NMR signal, and this minimum will occur at 1 over the J coupling here. Now, the important thing is the signal loss in this experiment will depend upon the number of cadmium atoms that are coordinated to selenium. This is because only when a selenium has a cadmium-113 attached to it will we see this reduction in NMR signal. So cadmium-113, it has an abundance of about 12%. So if I had 1 cadmium atom attached to my selenium, I'll see a reduction in signal of about 24% in this NMR experiment. But if I had 2 cadmiums attached, then I'll get to roughly a 40% reduction in signal. Now, when we analyze these curves, we usually plot it as this loss or buildup of this dephasing. And so again, I'm just showing you the predicted dephasing here as a function of the number of cadmiums that are correlated to selenium. Okay, so does this experiment work? So what we can do is watch the core cadmium NMR or the core selenium NMR signal while we pulse on cadmium. And the experiment works perfectly exactly as we would expect. We see this dephasing of about 65%. And that's because we know that a core selenium must be connected to 4 cadmium atoms. In this case, this J coupling is around 100 hertz. Okay, second experiment then is we now look at the surface selenium atoms while we pulse on cadmium. What's interesting is we get 2 different J couplings. We have J couplings that are around 65 or 100 hertz. And then we have 1 J coupling that's about 250 hertz. We've separately confirmed that J coupling is correct with some different experiments. But again, if we look at the dephasing, we get close to 60%. And that's consistent with our surface selenium atoms being bonded to 4 cadmiums, 2 surface cadmiums and 2 core cadmiums. Now we can flip the experiment around. We can look at cadmium while we apply this inversion pulse on selenium. This changes the statistics a bit because selenium is about 7% abundant. So we end up seeing about 28% or 30% dephasing. And so this is really consistent with those surface cadmium atoms having bonds to 2 seleniums. Okay, so that is just to summarize how we can really get detailed structural information about nanoparticle materials. If you're interested in nanoparticles, my group's got a bunch of other papers on other nanoparticle materials. I would encourage you to check those out. And I think we're very close to the time. So I'm going to leave it there. And again, thank all the students who did the work. And I acknowledge a lot of them throughout the talk. And thank you for your attention. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That's a fantastic talk. I always get surprised by how much you can do with NMR. It's great to see a lot of interesting work coming from there. I would like to share my slides back.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before we get started, I would like to encourage the panelists, if you have any question, prepare your questions so that we can jump right into those. And so without any further discussion, let me introduce our panelists. And our first panelist is Dr. Reddy, and Manju is got his MS in Bangalore, India in 2007, then moved to France, Marseille, where he got his PhD. Then he had a postdoc stay in Warwick and then UC Santa Barbara before he went back to University of Rio, where he is an assistant professor. He is an expert, or he's interested in hybrid organic and inorganic materials, photoelectronics, and reactive surfaces and interfaces and catalysis. Our next panelist is Dr. Kong, who received his BS in chemical physics from University of Science and Technology in China, then moved to Iowa State, where he got his PhD in 2010, then had a postdoctoral stay at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and then he did some work in a company, Western Digital Company, and then he joined the Department of Chemistry in Zhejiang in 2014. Then in 2023, he moved to the Institute of Translational Medicine in Shanghai Jiaotong University. His group specializes on solid-state NMR techniques for characterizing functional materials, metal organic frame, quantum dots, batteries, polymer heterogeneous catalysts, and bio-nanomaterials. Now, our next panelist is Dr. Hu, Yanyan Hu, got his BS in Tsinghua University, then a PhD in 2011, also from Iowa State, working with Professor Smil, who is now in Brandeis. Then she was a research fellow in University of Cambridge in the UK, working with Gray. Then jumped back into the US in 2014 to join Florida State University as an assistant professor, then went through the rank to associate in 2019, and then to full professor last year. She's an expert in NMR and does a lot of work on batteries and energy storage. So I want to welcome everybody to the panel. Welcome. So the floor is open for the panelists. If you have any question, let's get started. Dr. Reddy, you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Martin, for a kind introduction. And also let me thank and congratulate at the same time, Aaron, for such an impressive talk to both specialists as well as non-specialists from the NMR spectroscopy side. I really enjoyed it. I hope the audience too. I would like to kind of engage the discussion in such a way that after seeing such an impressive data, as well as the methods and how you can get these new insights into surfaces, subsurfaces, and the bulk. One thing that was coming over to my mind is that how do we probe this, for instance, in a time-resolved manner? Do you have any comments or thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge for NMR. So even with state-of-the-art techniques like DNP or indirect detection, lots of our surface NMR experiments, they still take minutes in the best case, if not hours. I think there's been a lot of interesting ideas in the NMR community to address the kind of time resolve questions that you're asking. So for example, I know Rob Tico's lab at National Institutes of Health, they're trying to do these time resolved experiments where they really look at protein folding and aggregation. And the idea they have there is that maybe with DNP, you can do this, and basically, you're going to allow your system to react for some time, and then you're going to capture it and freeze it and hopefully take a snapshot. So I don't know that we can do true time resolved in the sense of lots of like operando or in situ characterization techniques. But I think this idea of maybe using DNP and freezing to kind of take periodic snapshots of the system is an interesting one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have any other ideas in that direction?
Perhaps I was thinking about these high fields, and at least we may not be able to do it for the real catalytic conditions, but for those can be achievable with the moderate conditions, such as temperatures around 100 degrees Celsius or lower. That
I should also point out, I think there's been a lot of nice work done by people like Susanna Scott, and there's a group at Pacific Northwest National Labs that's been building these special in situ high temperature, high pressure rotors. And you're right, a lot of those systems, you can do chemical reactions inside the rotor. You can follow the kinetics, especially if the reaction's not too fast, as long as it's kind of happening on the time scale of a few minutes or less than an hour, something like this. And then I guess we should also point out maybe the work of people like Yan and Claire and other people in the battery world. They really are able to do kind of time-resolved NMR experiments. So
That's that some of these inspirations are really useful to take it further into different areas of research, where NMR is coming up as a primary technique to be able to look into these materials. And the another thought that I was having during this presentation is, it's wonderful. NMR is highly local, highly resolved, and extremely useful in a case where the other techniques may not play much. But what I imagine sometimes is like there is a chemistry that is happening between length scales of, let's say, a few angstroms to a nanometer, or at the very bulk level at the order of several tens of angstroms or several hundreds of nanometers and so on. What seems to be missing to me is that the length scales of the order of between, let's say, a nanometer to 10 nanometers. How do we imagine NMR as a sub-nanoscale techniques versus the real nanoscale world? During the talk that you went through, like, it was really it was really interesting to see that there were a lot of improvements in terms of sensitivity, for sure, and resolution by going to these multi-dimensional techniques and indirect detection and MQMAS type experiments and so on. What about this third axis, what we call as length scales improvement? Can we go beyond the real local nature of NMR into something what we call as intermediate range or long range?
Yeah, and I think that's a relatively well-established idea in NMR. So even if you go back to the classic work of Schmidt-Rohr and Hans Spiess, looking at things like block copolymer structures, we have this wonderful ability, I think, with NMR to probe the local environment, as you said, but we can also get a lot of information on long-range structural order, and we can basically exploit phenomenon like nuclear spin diffusion to probe those longer, let's say, length scales of tens or hundreds of nanometers, even up to micron length scales. So I saw Klaus gave a really fantastic talk at the ACS meeting recently, and he was showing all this beautiful work where he was analyzing proton spin diffusion data to really build up, let's say, mesostructures of natural wood samples. And with DNP, we have that same opportunity. In many ways, DNP accentuates or accelerates the contrast that you can get over kind of nanometer length scales. So Linden's done a lot of nice work where they've shown that even if you have these dilute spin 1/2 nuclei like silicon or cadmium, you can polarize the top layer of the surface of the nanoparticle, and then you can watch that polarization transfer into the bulk over kind of 1 to 10 nanometer length scales. So I think we do have the opportunity. DNP and high fields can make that better just because they can improve sensitivity, they can improve the contrast between the different spins. So yeah, that would be my answer there.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, like, how do you imagine this for very challenging quadrupolar nuclei?
Yeah, quadrupolar nuclei, spin diffusion is going to be a challenge because oftentimes the nuclear relaxation times are going to limit how far you can transport the magnetization into the sample. But in principle, it can still be done. I don't know that it has been done, but yeah, that's going to be a challenge. Spin 1/2 is where we're going to have to play that game for now. But
it's a really wonderful talk again. Like, let me kind of pass it on back to Martin, and congratulations on very interesting data.
Thanks, Madhu.
Aaron, it's always a treat to listen to your talk. And thank you very much for sharing. I think, the content you present is a very powerful manifestation of the power of solid-state NMR, in general NMR. So I appreciate it, and especially that those very delicate work to get to the atomic resolution of the structures using, multinuclear, advanced multidimensional NMR. That's really impressive. Thank you very much. So I wonder for the DNP NMR, it's a rising advanced technique for sensitivity enhancement for NMR, especially for inorganic materials. So you and Lyndon often to make these impregnated particles, right, with the polarizing agent. Do you think it's possible, let's say we plant some kind of paramagnetic metals on the surface? Would that, the efficiency may be low compared with the method you are using. Do you think is a possibility to do DNP?
Yeah, I think that's a question that a lot of materials people ask when they learn about DNP, because lots of materials people are making things where you have paramagnetic metal ions, you have unpaired electrons, so you should have some recipe to do DNP. You're right, there are a couple challenges with doing DNP with metal ions. There's been a lot of nice work on that by Bob Griffin's group, Bjorn Korzelius, Mikhail has done Leskes has done a lot of great work on using metal ions in oxides to do DNP. The primary challenge you face if you want to use, say, metal ions to do DNP is that they tend to have much broader EPR spectra. You also have this spin orbital angular momentum relaxation mechanism, so you tend to have much shorter electron T1 and T2, and so you're not able to saturate the EPR spectrum quite as well. So there are some friendly metals like gadolinium, copper, manganese. All of those metals have been shown you can do DNP with them. One of the other challenges too is that many of the metal ions have very different G values, so their EPR spectrum is often shifted very much as compared to a nitroxide. And so consequently, like with our current DNP setup, lots of the metals we couldn't even saturate because we just can't tune our magnetic field far enough to allow the gyrotron to irradiate their EPR spectrum. But I think this is really a long-term kind of challenge for DNP and NMR communities. The good news, if we take the optimistic view, is like the way that we're doing DNP right now is kind of like how we did NMR in the 1950s or 1960s, right? We have this continuous wave microwave source. We have this gyrotron, and this is really the only device that can, really provide us with these high power microwaves in this hundreds of gigahertz frequency range that we need to do this DNP experiment. But I think people like Bob Griffin and Xander Barnes, they have ideas for these next generation microwave sources. If we can move to pulsed DNP, that's going to be the future of DNP. And if you can go to pulsed DNP, hopefully this is like the transformation that we went through when we went from CW, continuous wave NMR, to pulsed NMR, right? So I think the DNP is really just kind of scratching the surface. There's lots of technical challenges that need to be overcome, but I think if we can get these next generation, and maybe it's going to take 20 or 30 years for the community to develop them, but if we can get those next generation pulsed microwave sources, then really we can start to more broadly utilize those paramagnetic centers that might be intrinsically present in materials.
Yeah, I totally agree, Aaron. I think there's a lot more we can do, in terms of the development of DNP technology. Related to that, if you look at the surface, often the surface, areas, they are filled with defects. Do you think some of the defects will have unpaired electrons that allow you to do polarization without adding external polarizing agents?
Yeah, I think that's also a great idea as well. So certainly if you look at lots of oxides, Syria comes to mind, right? you have these cerium 3+ surface vacancies, and you can see strong EPR signals when you just look at many materials, and it's because of those dangling bonds on the surfaces. People have done DNP using dangling silicon bonds that are present on silicon particles, for example. So again, at the moment, it just depends, do those defects or dangling bonds, do they have the right properties to be compatible with continuous wave DNP? If they do, then you can do it and you can maybe learn something, although, you probably expect to get maybe 5 or 10 enhancement rather than 100 or 200 DNP enhancement. But yeah, again, I'm optimistic that if we can get this kind of next generation DNP technology developed as a community, then those types of things will be routine.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. So I think other panelists may have questions. I will hold on for a little bit.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, Aaron, it's a very nice talk, and you showed solid-state NMR is so good, it can do almost everything on the nanomaterials. Yeah, so I'm so glad I share a lot of similar interest with you on the nanocrystals. So I think lots of our work complement each other. So yeah, I think we can pursue this direction in the future and do some real collaborations on these materials. So I just have some questions, like for some people who don't do solid-state NMR that often. So it feels like for many people that for each material or each different questions, you have to use different solutions. So it's very complicated and very, so it's very system dependent solutions to each type of questions. So how should you approach each question? Do you have some comments for you to be on this direction? So like for many people who don't do NMR, they probably first they don't know what questions to ask, and then when they have the question, they may don't know what type of technique to use. And so do you have further comments on this?
Yeah, I think what you raise is a really difficult problem for NMR in general, and I don't know that there is a good answer to it. I mean, unfortunately, you're right. NMR is not really at the level of some technique like X-ray diffraction or SEM or TEM, where you can just grab your sample, put it in the instrument. As long as you have a decent technician who really knows how to keep the instrument running and alive, you can really teach kind of a casual user to get good data from it, right? I don't know. This is a real challenge, I think, for NMR and for our community. But the best thing I would say is, there's lots of great NMR people all over the world. We've got 3 here on the panel who are located all over. So the best thing a materials person can do is just talk to somebody who does NMR and start asking, what could we learn about the system? I think at the end of the day, you do still need to have that expert knowledge.
Yeah, I agree with you. So often the people come to us, and I think we have to be part of this project, not just a person who do the experiments. So we have to be a real expert on the materials itself to know how to solve these questions. So
yeah, I fully agree. I mean, the best collaborations I've had are really when the materials chemists are engaged, and we're really involved at all stages of the project, the initial synthesis of the materials, once they start to get kind of property measurements, and I think the harder collaborations are just when exactly what you said. Somebody just goes, "Here's this sample I made. Can you analyze this?" And there's not a lot of information. So I think communication is probably the best way to overcome some of those challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope the people in the audience can, like, when you have questions, can start to reach out to real experts of NMR.
Yeah, and there are hundreds and if not thousands around the world now. So that's the good news.
Yeah, I really agree with
hope,
this.
and more people can get into the field. If you are interested, you should know more about the technique itself to be, or even you are a student, you can start to involve in this field, to start to look for PhDs or postdocs in this field. Encourage the audience.
Very good. And actually, I can comment on that as an end user of the NMR, non-expert. I can tell you that some of the stuff that you see from NMR from my end looks like magic. The information you can pull out. I remember, Aaron, you had to develop a new method to do to analyze. That becomes real. It opens up a whole new level into spaces that NMR can now go, because we could see almost is like getting interesting. Now I'm going to switch up a little bit and ask all of you as experts in NMR, what is the price one has to pay to get into the field? And I'd like to hear from all of you. What do you need to do to be getting the kind of data that we saw today?
Well, you need to be as smart as Aaron.
Well, I don't know about that, but I don't think it's that hard. I think especially in the field of materials NMR, there's so many good people working on materials NMR. If they're not at your institution, there's certainly going to be one in your country, if not in your state, right? So I think you can find people. So Martin, you're in North Carolina. That's not too far from Florida. So you can also go talk to Yan Yan sometime, and I'm sure she'd be happy to run some materials for you. I should also point out there are a number of like excellent user programs around the world now too.
Yeah.
So the Magnet Lab in Tallahassee that I mentioned, we use that facility free of charge. Anybody can use it free of charge. It's an NSF funded user facility. All it takes to get magnet time there is a 2 or 3 page proposal. It's very fast to review the proposal. And so then you can have magnet time and you can run some samples. Now, if you're not an NMR expert, you might be better to collaborate with somebody, and then there's people at the Magnet Lab that can help you do that. I know from a European perspective too, there's also this Panacea project, which is really doing well. And again, it's a similar kind of idea to the Magnet Lab. Any researcher in Europe can basically apply for NMR time. That Panacea network will connect you with a collaborator. It's delocalized across many European countries. So that's also a great network, and there's lots of shared facilities for people to get into NMR. And I'll be glad to hear what some of the other panelists have to say as well.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Aaron. I think to add to that, so for non-NMR experts, if you want to get amazing data as what Aaron showed, one of the most important thing is you have to be clear what kind of questions you're trying to address. You can convey these questions to the NMR experts or your collaborators, so they can propose the appropriate NMR methods to answer those questions. So I think this is very important step of communication for getting really good NMR data that are actually useful for your projects.
Yeah, I think in a different perspective, I think in the world we are still short of NMR experts, especially solid-state NMR experts. I think probably this is very common in China, that we only have, I think, a few groups that are doing real solid-state NMR. So we need more experts. We have lots of instruments, more and more instruments, but the real experts are still like.
Yeah, when you
Well, I would just comment that if I look at China, there's more and more good groups though, right? So I think things are going in the right direction.
Yeah, but there are more and more people doing materials research. So the systems and the questions are just way above the capability we can solve.
I think that's why I was asking that question, because for me, when I got introduced to DNP by Aaron, it is almost like, why didn't we have this in our curriculum, in our materials curriculum? Why don't we teach this as an essential tool? Because it's so information rich, but so few people in materials know anything about what they can do with their solid state NMR. And I almost feel like it's a disservice, because we, as a material scientist, we're so caught up in the traditional tools. You get an SEM, you get an XLD, but you never get that fine detail about your interfaces, about the intricate details of materials that are not 100% ordered. And I got into this by accident because I had a material that we tried to do single crystal XLD. We'll get two-dimensional order, the third dimension will never work. And as we were looking for something, I learned about the potential to use the NMR, but it was even more than I could even think about. I feel that there's such a need in materials, but the people in the field don't know. So how do we get more people? How do we get the information? How do we recruit more inorganic materials into this field? And how do we make them aware so that we can start now cross-training people who are material scientists in background, but they're hardcore NMR people? The same way we have TEM. We have people who are material scientists and they're really into TEM, or they're into atom probe, or they're into any form of microscopy. How do we shift this partnership into this material chemistry space that is engineering and physical sciences at the same time? I'd like to hear your opinions about that.
Well, the thing is, there are already some training activities about that, as Aaron mentioned already. So as the field is advancing, we're also trying to push the boundaries and then trying to involve more and more people around the world through these programs that Aaron just mentioned. These high field NMR facilities are not only the local deal now anymore, it's quite international. They're all part of these international networks. We're happy to welcome the users and also organize workshops and routine meetings, user meetings, and welcome the users, ask questions, whether they're experts or non-experts, then try to address all sorts of questions that could be related to technical or field advancements, or what kind of materials we can look into, or what kind of problems that we cannot address. That brings like opportunities as well as challenges for the next 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years in the field to be able to address, and also to direct the field in a direction that others need it, not only the NMR spectroscopists need it. This seems to be kind of the way forward by taking the opinions from the other areas of research. There are so many materials we still haven't been able to look into. One example that Aaron brought into was vaccines. There are very few papers on this area. It's just because these materials are highly complicated to look into from NMR, the reasons that they're highly metallic. We've been trying to work on this, but with very limited success, and also so the other groups as well. But there are many other areas, such as vaccines, as I mentioned, where NMR still has to establish its own expertise. So we need these challengers that have to come on challenges. Then we should be able to perhaps change our way of thinking how we do NMR, how to make it more general, how to make it more understandable, and then transmit this knowledge to a non-expert that eventually one day, well, perhaps everyone would like to do NMR on their materials.
Yeah, very good. I think for the sake of time, if you allow me, I think I would encourage this conversation, and maybe we should start thinking about teaching courses across disciplines. We become discipline agnostic. because that I think we need people who understand the potential of this technique and how it can resolve a lot of problems we have in technology development on the engineering side. But if you allow me, for the sake of time, to move on, I want to thank everyone in the panel. We will continue this discussion offline, and we'll look forward to having another NMR expert to tell us more about this wonderful technique and what we can do with it. So Aaron, we want to present this virtually to you for being our speaker. We will be sending this to you by email, but our real live would have presented it as a plaque to you. So thank you very much for introducing this technique to the world. And with that, I want to make an announcement for next week. Next week, on Friday, we will be having Asian Day. It is our continued journey across the continents. This year in iCANX, we have done Africa, then we had Oceania, then we have Asian Day, and we have Europe and the Americas coming up shortly after this. And so join the co-host, Misok Kim, who will be hosting this, and Alice is going to be in the panelist. And with that, I want to thank you all, and thank you for joining us on iCANX as we connect the world and the universe through science. Thank you, everyone.
不再是奇迹，不再是幻想，此刻真感觉全世界对我鼓掌。不必太在意身旁惊奇的目光，可以点点头，可以放声歌唱。我创造奇迹，我拥有梦想，我希望看见所有骄傲的脸庞。不再为曾经失败放弃或感伤，努力才是真的方向。I can， 没有什么可以阻挡心中无限的力量。I can， 你也能够像我一样飞越最高山岗。I can。没有什么可以阻挡心中无限的力量。I can， 你也能够像我一样飞越最高山岗。创造奇迹，我拥有梦想，我希望看见所有骄傲的脸庞。不再为曾经失败放弃或感伤，努力才是真的方向。I can， 没有什么